The envelope looked ordinary, the kind of plain white mailer I usually ignored until after breakfast. But the return address, our family's manufacturing business, made my breath catch. I slid a finger under the flap, expecting another quarterly report I would skim over tea. Instead, a single sheet of paper slipped out and floated onto the counter. When I saw the number printed on it, the world seemed to tilt. The dividend payout for my 10% ownership stake was almost triple what I'd earned in my best year of teaching. I pressed my palm against the cool countertop, steadying myself. My hands tingled, not from greed, but from the undeniable shift I felt deep in my chest. Something had changed, something irreversible. And then I heard the voice message from my sister, Judith. "Did you get your little check yet?" she said, with the tone she'd perfected over the years. One part mockery, one part superiority. "Must be cute having 10%. I bet it doesn't even cover your property taxes." She laughed, a sound I had grown to absorb like cold wind through old windows. But this time, the laugh didn't slip past me. It struck something solid. I looked again at the number on the page. A number I hadn't expected. A number I knew Judith wasn't expecting either. A strange calm settled over me, the kind that arrives moments before a storm breaks open. I realized that this wasn't just about money. I knew it even then. It was about 30 years of minimizing comments, strategic exclusions, decisions she made without me, and the clever way she'd always angled herself as the sun around which the rest of us were meant to orbit. I folded the paper, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it neatly beside the kettle. Because this was only the beginning. Judith had spent our lives assuming she had everything: power, position, control, and that I had nothing. She believed that my 10% stake was symbolic of my place in the family. She didn't know what was coming, and she certainly didn't know how profoundly the truth would unravel her. As the kettle clicked off, releasing a thin stream of steam into the kitchen, I whispered to myself, "She's not going to laugh at this." What I didn't understand at that moment, standing barefoot in my kitchen, holding the dividend check that would ignite everything, was that uncovering how that number became so large would force me into a maze of secrets Judith had buried decades ago. And once I saw what she'd done, revenge was no longer an indulgence. It became an obligation. But before any of that unfolded, before the consequences and confessions, I had to tell you how it all began. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I am 63 years old. I say my age with the same steadiness with which I've learned to say my name. Firm, without apology, and without shrinking into the background the way I did for far too long. I spent 38 years teaching literature at the local high school, guiding teenagers through the tangled worlds of Shakespeare, Baldwin, Morrison, and Steinbeck, while quietly navigating my own tangled world at home. I retired 5 years ago, imagining that my days would be filled with gardening, long walks, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived simply. I hadn't planned to become entangled in business affairs, legal evaluations, or decades-old financial distortions. But life rarely asks for permission before reshaping itself. I live alone now in the small colonial house I inherited from our parents. Judith moved into a newer, larger home years ago. 5 bedrooms, high ceilings, a kitchen she never really cooked in. She liked spaces that made her feel important. I liked spaces that made me feel grounded. Our differences had always been that simple and that complicated. Growing up, Judith was the shining one, brilliant, quick, unafraid to speak her mind. I admired her once, before I understood that admiration can turn into a kind of shadow you carry behind you. I learned early that my gentleness was not a trait she valued. My quietness irritated her. My patience baffled her. My habit of thinking things through before speaking annoyed her to no end. And yet, despite all that, she always insisted we were a team, though the definition of that word seemed to shift in whatever direction benefited her most. When our parents passed, Dad first, then Mom, Judith and I became the stewards of the family manufacturing business, a small but sturdy operation that produced custom metal components for farm equipment. I never intended to run it, and Judith jumped at the role. She negotiated the estate so that I held a simple 10% stake. For fairness, she'd said at the time, while she became the managing partner with a much larger share. I didn't protest. I never did back then. I believed she knew best. I believed she would operate ethically. I believed family meant trust. Retirement gave me space. Space to breathe, to observe, and eventually to question. And standing there that morning with the dividend check in my hands, I felt something shift in me. It wasn't greed. It was awakening. The kind that arrives late in life, soft but insistent. I didn't know yet that this awakening would lead me into the deepest truth my sister had spent years hiding. But I felt it coming, and I knew my quiet days were over. Judith and I were two branches on the same tree, growing in opposite directions despite sharing the same roots. She was our father's pride, assertive, iron-willed, capable of walking into a room and bending it toward her center. I was more like our mother, observant, thoughtful, slow to anger, slow to accuse. Our father used to say that Judith would run the world while I would teach it, and he meant it as a compliment. But even compliments can become chains when repeated often enough. When Dad expanded the factory in the late 80s, Judith shadowed him through every decision. She learned about supply chains, vendor contracts, tax structures, and labor negotiations before she finished high school. Meanwhile, I earned scholarships, dug through novels like a woman searching for oxygen, and built a life around stories, language, and young minds that were still malleable. We were both hardworking, just in different worlds. Yet the divide between us widened slowly, almost imperceptibly. Judith's achievements made her feel entitled to dominance. Mine made me content with humility. She interpreted that humility as weakness. I interpreted her dominance as responsibility. Neither interpretation was entirely true. Even after our parents passed, I tried to maintain the fragile peace that held the two of us together. She controlled the business. I controlled nothing that she didn't approve. Holidays were polite. Birthdays were predictable. Phone calls were shallow. And whenever finances came up, she spoke as though she were educating a child. "Don't worry about the details, Evelyn," she'd say. "Your 10% is symbolic. Think of it like a gesture." A gesture. That word lingered in me for years. Our relationship wasn't hostile, but it was imbalanced in a way that eroded the foundation slowly, like water carving through stone. When Judith laughed at my stake in the company, she wasn't mocking the percentage. She was mocking the position she believed I occupied in life. The lesser sister. The softer one. The one who didn't fight back. But she underestimated something critical. Patience is not passivity. Quiet is not concession. Stillness is not surrender. I had spent decades observing, absorbing, listening. I knew the rhythms of our family, the patterns of Judith's behavior, the undercurrent of every conversation we'd ever had. And when the dividend check arrived that morning, and her mocking voicemail followed minutes later, every unbalanced moment in our history aligned in perfect clarity. The ground beneath us was shifting, and neither of us could pretend otherwise anymore. What I didn't realize, not yet, was that Judith's laughter wasn't rooted in confidence. It was rooted in fear. Fear of what would happen if I ever looked closely at the numbers she had so carefully kept out of sight. And soon, I would look closer than she ever imagined. The betrayal didn't strike me like lightning. It revealed itself slowly, like a stain spreading through fabric. After that dividend check arrived, curiosity took hold of me in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't greed. It was confusion. Something about the amount didn't align with the image Judith had painted for years. An image of a modest but steady business, margins tight but manageable, profits stable but unremarkable. If 10% yielded this, what was the whole picture? I emailed Judith politely, asking for the most recent financial statements. She took 2 days to reply and simply wrote, "Everything is fine. Don't worry about it." No attachments. No explanation. That was the first crack. I asked again, and this time she called instead of writing. "Evelyn," she began, using the overly patient tone she reserved for condescension. "These documents are complicated. You wouldn't find them useful. Your dividend is accurate. That's all you need to know." But it wasn't. And for the first time in years, I didn't shrink back. I asked again. She ended the call abruptly. The second crack appeared when I found Dad's old ledger books in a cedar box in my attic. Dusty, yellowed, written in his careful block handwriting. Numbers from decades ago, predictions he'd made for the company's growth. His notes were meticulous, and his margins always included reminders to keep things transparent for the girls. Transparent. I almost laughed. While flipping through those ledgers, I found something else, an old letter addressed to both Judith and me, written by Dad shortly before he died. Inside, he explained the ownership distribution. He emphasized equality. He wrote that the company, even if run by one sister, belonged morally to both. My 10%, he said, was to ensure that I always had security. He never intended inequality. Judith had. That realization hit me with the slow heaviness of grief. It wasn't just that she'd minimized my role. It was that she'd manipulated a system he'd built with fairness in mind. I began searching publicly available filings, annual reports, state business records, supplier contracts. And there, tucked in plain sight, I found the third crack. For years, Judith had been diverting company funds into a separate consulting firm she owned privately. She'd disguised these transfers as operational expenses. My stomach tightened as I read line after line. What she had taken wasn't just money. It was trust. It was security. It was the legacy our parents built. And then the betrayal sharpened. Records showed she had diluted my 10% stake without my consent 3 years ago during a quiet restructuring. Legally dubious. Ethically bankrupt. Financially calculated. She had counted on my ignorance. She had counted wrong. And as I sat there, the papers spread across my dining table like scattered clues. I felt the first surge of something I hadn't felt in decades: resolve. If Judith thought I would let this go, she didn't know me anymore. Or perhaps she never truly did. The next morning, I gathered everything: Dad's ledgers, the dividend statement, the public records I'd printed, even the voicemail Judith had left. I placed them in a clean folder labeled with nothing but the date. Then I made a pot of tea, sat down at the kitchen table, and searched for a business attorney with experience in shareholder disputes. I found Margaret Delaney, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s whose voice carried the weight of 5 decades in corporate law. When I explained my situation, she didn't interrupt. She didn't rush me. She listened with the quiet intensity of someone assembling a puzzle while you spoke. When I finished, she exhaled slowly and said, "Mrs. Harper, none of what you've described is small. And none of it is legal if it occurred as you suspect." She asked me to bring everything to her office that afternoon. Her firm smelled faintly of paper and lavender. I laid the documents before her, piece by piece, like a confession. She scrutinized each page, cross-referencing numbers, dates, and signatures. When she reached the section about the dilution of my stake, she lifted her glasses and looked directly at me. "Did you sign this?" she asked. "No." "Did you authorize it verbally?" "No." "Then this is a serious violation." Her calmness steadied me, even as my pulse thudded in my throat. Margaret made several calls while I waited, speaking with an accountant, a corporate investigator, and a colleague well-versed in family business disputes. Every word she said confirmed the truth. Judith had been siphoning money and eroding my ownership, counting on me to stay quiet and uninformed. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Judith has put herself in a dangerous position. Not just morally, but legally. However, our goal is not to destroy the business, only to restore your rightful standing and transparency. Ethical revenge. The kind that didn't sink ships but corrected their course." She assigned me tasks: gather every financial document Judith had ever sent me, even newsletters. Write down any conversation where Judith mentioned my stake. Locate our parents' wills and estate documents. Check bank records for dividend inconsistencies. Over the next week, my home became an archive. Papers covered the dining table, the coffee table, even the spare bedroom bed. I worked methodically, labeling everything, building a timeline, learning the language of business one term at a time. And with each discovery, the narrative sharpened. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. Margaret compiled everything into a formal demand packet, nearly 70 pages long, and sent it to Judith's attorney. Within hours, the phone calls began. Judith first, then her lawyer, then both at once. I didn't answer. Margaret had told me not to. And as I watched my phone buzz again and again, the truth settled over me like a cloak. Judith wasn't confused. She was cornered. But the real turning point hadn't arrived yet. That would come when she saw what I knew, and realized the consequences were no longer hers to control. The confrontation wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. It wasn't even emotional. It unfolded in a polished conference room at Margaret's office, sunlight glinting off framed certificates and the glossy surface of a mahogany table. Judith arrived wearing confidence like armor, shoulders back, chin lifted, lips pressed into the smile she used when she wanted to appear magnanimous rather than guilty. But when she saw the stack of documents in front of me, her expression flickered. Just for a moment, a tremor beneath the surface. Margaret greeted her formally. Judith nodded stiffly and took her seat across from me. For the first time in years, I didn't lower my gaze. I held her eyes, steady and calm. Margaret began. Ms. Harper, we've conducted a preliminary review of the company's financial structure and have identified several serious irregularities regarding your sister's ownership stake and profit distributions. Judith's jaw tightened. Irregularities implies wrongdoing, which I reject. Margaret continued unfazed. The documents suggest unauthorized dilution of a shareholder's interest, misclassification of expenses, and transfer of company funds to an entity you own privately. Judith snapped. Evelyn doesn't understand the complexity of this business. I finally spoke. I understand that Dad never intended inequality. I understand that you acted without my consent. And I understand that you've been benefiting from money that belonged to both of us. Something inside Judith cracked then, not visibly but audibly, in the silence that followed. She shifted tactics, lowering her voice. Evelyn, you've always been too sensitive. The business needed restructuring. I protected you from decisions you couldn't manage. You should be thanking me. Margaret slid the legal packet toward her. Your explanation does not absolve the violations. We are prepared to file for a full forensic audit, restitution of misappropriated funds, reinstatement of Ms. Harper's original stake, and punitive damages should negotiations fail. Judith stared at the packet as if it were a bomb. I exhaled softly. I don't want to destroy the company, Judith. I want transparency. I want equality. And I want what was taken from me restored. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The room felt still, as though the air itself had paused. Margaret concluded, You have 10 business days to respond with a corrective plan. After that, we proceed formally. Judith rose abruptly, gathering her purse. But before leaving, she turned to me, her voice low and trembling, not with anger, but with something that sounded like disbelief. You did this to me? I shook my head. You did this to yourself. The door clicked shut behind her. And that was the moment, the precise, crystalline moment, when I knew I had crossed a threshold I could never uncross. I wasn't the quiet sister anymore. I was the equal one. Judith simply had to learn it the hard way. The fallout came quietly, the way winter frost claims a garden. Slow, steady, indifferent to resistance. Judith tried, at first, to reclaim control. She sent long emails attempting to justify her decisions. She blamed accountants, market volatility, even Dad's outdated vision. None of it mattered. Margaret filed the formal demand with the court after Judith missed the deadline by a full week. The forensic audit began, and Judith's composure began to erode. The auditors discovered the extent of the transfers she had routed into her private firm. They traced the expenses she had disguised. Personal travel labeled as supplier outreach, home renovations masked as facility upgrades, even her luxury SUV tucked neatly under transportation assets. Every layer they peeled back revealed more she had hoped would remain buried. But the most damning discovery was this. The dilution of my shares had been executed improperly. Without unanimous shareholder consent, meaning mine, it was invalid. Worse, the attempt itself was a breach of fiduciary duty. Her lawyer reached out the moment the auditors presented their preliminary findings. He sounded tired, defeated, and entirely aware of the gravity. Negotiations began, not from a place of power, but from an urgent need to contain the damage. Judith sat rigidly during each meeting, her voice growing quieter, her presence shrinking as if the truth were pressing down on her. In the final negotiation session, her lawyer spoke on her behalf. Ms. Harper is prepared to restore the original 10% stake, compensate for all diluted earnings, repay misclassified withdrawals, and restructure the governance to include full oversight by both parties. Margaret added calmly, additionally, she will relinquish managing partner status. A neutral executive will be appointed until operational trust is rebuilt. Judith flinched, the words striking her pride harder than any financial penalty could. But she said nothing. Not one protest. Not one excuse. Her downfall wasn't public. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the cinematic collapse she had once imagined befalling others. It was quiet, administrative, recorded in legal documents and amendments signed in triplicate. The kind of downfall that lingers. The kind one remembers every time they sit in a meeting where they no longer hold the head seat. The kind that reshapes a life. When the final signatures were done, Judith stood abruptly, avoiding my eyes as she gathered her coat. But as she walked past me, she murmured, voice barely audible, "You never should have pushed this far." I replied gently, "I didn't push you. I revealed you." She froze for a moment, her shoulders tightening. Then she walked out of the room, leaving the echo of her footsteps trailing her like an unfinished sentence. Her control was gone, her secrets dismantled, and the truth, finally, was no longer hers to hide. In the weeks that followed, the quiet in my home felt different. Not the stillness of absence, but the stillness of clarity. I returned to my morning routines, my gardening, my books, my peaceful rituals. But beneath it all was something new. An internal space that had once been occupied by doubt and resignation, now filled with calm assurance. The company appointed an interim director, a man named Thomas Whitaker with decades of experience in ethical corporate management. He reached out to me personally, inviting me to monthly shareholder meetings and encouraging my involvement. Not as a courtesy, but as a right. I attended each one, learning gradually, asking questions, finding my footing in a world Judith had once claimed as hers alone. The dividend checks continued. Accurate now, transparent, accompanied by full financial reports I read with growing confidence. I wasn't just a symbolic owner anymore. I was an informed one. Judith, meanwhile, kept her distance. She complied with the restructuring, but avoided all non-essential communication. Her silence was a landscape unto itself, barren, heavy, unfamiliar. I didn't take pleasure in her discomfort, but I didn't rescue her from it either. Consequences need room to breathe. One afternoon, I received a short email from her. No greeting. No signature. Just this. I didn't think you had it in you. I stared at the words for a long moment before replying. I've always had it. You simply never looked closely. She didn't respond. Months passed, and the company stabilized under its new leadership. I grew into my role with quiet confidence. The sense of justice didn't feel like victory, it felt like restoration. The weight I'd carried for decades had lifted, leaving behind something lighter, something truer. One spring morning, while pruning my roses, I realized that the ache between Judith and me wasn't anger anymore. It was grief. Grief for the relationship that could have been. Grief for a sister who had chosen control over connection. Grief for the years lost to imbalance and silence. But even grief, when acknowledged, begins to heal. For the first time, I allowed myself to hope, not for reconciliation, but for release. Not every relationship can be rebuilt, but every person can reclaim themselves. And that is what I had done. Quietly. Steadily. Completely. Now, standing firmly on the other side of that long, shadowed journey, I can tell you this with certainty. The truth is patient. It waits beneath every false word, beneath every manipulation, beneath every injustice. It waits for the moment you finally choose to see it. When Judith laughed at my 10% stake, she wasn't laughing at the number. She was laughing at the version of me she thought still existed. The sister who stayed small, who avoided conflict, who mistook silence for peace. But age gives you perspective. Experience gives you strength. And betrayal gives you clarity. My dividend check was never the victory. The victory was the moment I realized that my voice mattered as much as hers. The victory was choosing truth over comfort. The victory was standing up not to overpower her, but to honor myself. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Ethical revenge isn't about hurting someone who wronged you. It's about restoring what they tried to take, your dignity, your agency, your rightful place in your own life. And sometimes, the most powerful confrontation is simply revealing the truth they hoped you'd never find. Judith taught me many things, though not in the way she intended. She taught me that silence can be mistaken for weakness, but it can also be the place where strength is born. She taught me that family bonds can bend and warp, but integrity must remain straight. And she taught me that those who underestimate you often overestimate themselves. I don't know what will become of our relationship in the years ahead. Maybe the distance will remain. Maybe time will soften us both. But I no longer wait for Judith to validate my place in the world. I know who I am. I know what I own. I know what I deserve. And I know this. A 10% stake can be worth far more than a controlling share, if you have the courage to claim the truth behind it. Thank you for listening. My father believed he was too important, too clever, too foundational to ever be questioned. But life has a way of leveling the ground beneath those who think they stand above consequences. His downfall wasn't my victory. It was his reckoning. What I gained wasn't satisfaction at his expense. It was clarity, distance, freedom. I learned that loyalty without accountability becomes servitude, and silence in the face of wrongdoing becomes complicity. For years, I had been the quiet buffer, absorbing the shockwaves of my father's decisions so others wouldn't have to. I had mistaken endurance for virtue and sacrifice for love. But real love, real integrity, sometimes requires stepping back, not stepping in. When I let the auditors hand him the report, I wasn't punishing him. I was choosing myself. I was choosing truth. And I was choosing a future not built on protecting someone who had relied far too long on my protection. So if there is a lesson in all of this, it's one I offer humbly, from the perspective of a woman who spent a lifetime learning it the hard way. You cannot save someone from the consequences they choose for themselves. And you should never set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, especially when that person expects the flames to burn quietly, endlessly, without gratitude. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it walks in through the door wearing an auditor's badge. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all.